He has never spoken a word, never written a sentence, never said his own name. At 70 years old, Ray Whittaker remains a living mystery, the man who barks to communicate, who growls instead of replying, who walks the hills of West Virginia with the wide, unblinking eyes of someone who may see the world from an entirely different place. Ray is one of the last surviving members of a family shaped by deep generational inbreeding. Born in Odd, a small, remote community in rural West Virginia, he lives in seclusion with his siblings. His story isn't told through language or memory. He has none to offer in the usual sense, but through patterns, reactions, and a silent, persistent presence. Some have called Ray the most inbred boy in American history still alive. That title, however harsh, isn't empty. His family line includes multiple first cousin marriages. His parents were first cousins. His grandparents were identical twin brothers. Ray's family tree doesn't branch, it loops. But Ray is not just the sum of his DNA. He is a whole person, though many may not see him that way. Despite having no spoken language, Ray responds. He barks if someone blocks his path. He gestures when something bothers him. He sometimes smiles. Other times, he flinches. There is someone present inside him, even if that presence doesn't look or sound like what we're used to recognizing. This is Ray's story, not just of what he inherited, but of what he lives. A story of a man who exists on the margins of language, but not of feeling. He is alive. He senses. And despite the silence, he says more than most. To understand Ray, we must first understand the bloodline that made him. To understand Ray Whittaker, one cannot begin with Ray himself. His story starts generations before he was born, with a family tree that never spread its branches, only curved inward. Ray's father was John Emery Whittaker. His mother, Gracie Irene Whittaker. They were first cousins. That detail alone would raise eyebrows in most families, but it was just the beginning. John Emery and Gracie Irene were the children of identical twin brothers, Henry Wade and John Isom Whittaker. That means Ray's grandfathers were not just brothers, they were genetically mirror images of each other, and Gracie's mother, Ada Adeline, was also a first cousin to her husband, John Isom. In genetic terms, Ray's lineage is a closed loop, repeated over and over. What happens when generations of the same DNA are recycled without variation? Science offers a term, autosomal recessive expression. It means rare genetic traits, normally silent, can become active and dominant when inherited from both parents. Over time, this leads to increased risk of congenital disorders, cognitive impairments, and physical anomalies. Ray is not a theory. He is a living embodiment of this reality. There is no official diagnosis, but it is widely assumed that Ray suffers from nonverbal autism, likely at level 3, the most severe classification. But what shaped this condition? Genetics alone do not explain everything. The combination of deep inbreeding, lack of prenatal care, isolation from medical systems, and total educational exclusion created an environment where any vulnerability became a lifelong barrier. This is not simply a story of inherited biology. It is a story of systemic absence. No schooling, no specialists, no structure beyond the family unit itself. Ray was born into a genetic cage, but he was also left without the keys that many children with developmental differences might receive: early intervention, therapy, or even diagnosis. And yet, he survived. He wasn't institutionalized. He wasn't abandoned. He was raised by the same people who share his blood and his struggles. In that world, however limited, he found continuity, however imperfect. The same DNA that may have hindered his development also created the web of caretakers who kept him fed, clothed, and watched over. Looking at Ray, it's easy to see the effects of inheritance. But harder, and more important, is to ask how that inheritance has shaped not just his body, but his place in the world. He didn't choose this life. It was mapped for him long before he was born. And still, Ray walks through it. A man made by history, carried by family, and shaped by biology, but never fully defined by any of them. To see the man behind the genetics, we must now step into his world, the one he doesn't describe in words, but in action. Ray Whittaker does not speak, read, or write. But that does not mean he is silent inside. His world is simply one we are not accustomed to entering. To understand him, we must abandon our usual definitions of intelligence, language, and communication. Ray's behaviors appear strange at first glance, sometimes even alarming. He grunts and growls when approached. He may bark if someone blocks his path. He gestures with purpose, often emphatically, but without conventional structure. There are moments of agitation, unpredictability, even defiance. But beneath these outward signs is a system, not random chaos, patterned intention. Observers have noted that Ray is responsive. He may not use words, but he reacts in ways that indicate understanding. He knows when he's being addressed. He makes choices, expresses preferences. If he doesn't like something, you'll know. If he's content, it shows in how he moves, or how still he becomes. He doesn't mimic, he initiates. He doesn't perform, he participates in his own way. One of Ray's most telling characteristics is his relationship with tasks. He engages with single actions, throwing a ball, placing an object, but often does not follow through with multi-step sequences. He might toss a bowling ball down a lane, then immediately walk away without watching the pins fall. He might place a Christmas ornament near a tree branch but not hang it. It's not apathy. It's as if his cognition flows in single pulses. Intention, action, stop. Cause and effect blur into the moment. There is also repetition. He might perform the same motion multiple times, not compulsively, but as if trying to make sense of it or communicate something with it. Repetition, in Ray's case, seems to function as both expression and orientation. His world is built less on words and more on rhythm, instinct, and sensory cues. In many ways, Ray resembles individuals with severe nonverbal autism, particularly level 3 on the clinical spectrum. That diagnosis has never been confirmed for him, but the behaviors are consistent: minimal or absent language, marked impairment in daily functioning, and a need for structure and familiarity. But Ray is more than a label or a pattern of behaviors. What makes his case so complex is that he demonstrates presence. He watches. He recognizes people. He has startled, fled, laughed, growled, and reached out to touch hands. He responds with emotion, even if the delivery is unconventional. People often mistake lack of speech for lack of thought. But those who've spent time with Ray report something else: awareness. It may not be verbal awareness, but it is deeply reactive. He shows frustration when interrupted. He seeks space when overwhelmed. He communicates needs on his terms. And that's the point. His mind operates on a different bandwidth, not lesser, just harder to interpret. What's especially moving is that Ray doesn't perform for attention. He never has. There is no act. Every gesture, every response seems sincere, raw, and unfiltered. That unmediated quality gives insight into how he perceives the world, directly, without narrative, without pretense. It's not always peaceful. Ray has outbursts. When corrected or overwhelmed, he may scream, lash out, or run. These episodes can seem violent or confusing, but they're not malicious. They're expressions of boundary, discomfort, or overload. In those moments, his behavior is not just a reaction to stimuli. It's a statement of self-protection. And in that, perhaps, lies the clearest evidence of an internal life. Ray doesn't live in a void. He lives in a world that most of us have never learned to hear. But if we listen closely, not for words, but for intention, we begin to understand that his silence is not empty. It's just untranslated. To see how that inner world meets the physical one, we now move outward. From Ray's mind to the body that carries him. Ray Whittaker's body tells its own story. a quiet chronicle of wear, endurance, and unacknowledged pain. It's a body that has never known a hospital room as a child, a physical therapist, or even routine medical attention. For decades, it simply endured. By the time Ray turned 70, he had developed a noticeable limp. His movements slowed, his steps shortened. He began favoring one leg, wincing at times when shifting his weight. It was pain, plain and simple, but for a long time, it went unnamed. A family friend attributed it to age, and for Ray, that was diagnosis enough. Eventually, someone brought him to a doctor. For the first time in his life. The visit was brief. His knee was examined. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't resist. He sat, as he always has, in quiet compliance with a world that rarely explained itself to him. Ray's physical condition reflects years of unmanaged strain. His posture is slightly hunched. His limbs move with effort. And yet, there is resilience in how he carries himself. He walks without assistance. He eats with his hands. He urinates when and where he must, not to offend, but because his body obeys urgency, not etiquette. There is something startlingly raw in this autonomy. Ray may not follow social rules, but his body still insists on its own logic, its own timing. It demands, it navigates, it persists. That persistence, in the absence of medical care or accommodation, is a kind of quiet rebellion. It's survival on instinct. He shows no outward signs of chronic disease beyond his aging joints. But decades of malnutrition, lack of dental care, and possible genetic anomalies have left their imprint. His eyes bulge slightly, wide and uneven. His expression can appear fixed, even startled. His hands are often clenched, as if holding on to something we cannot see. Still he moves. Slowly, yes. Sometimes clumsily, but unrelentingly. Ray's body, much like his mind, does not conform. It adapts. It continues. It does not ask for pity. It simply exists, and that existence is its own form of protest. But Ray does not live alone. His endurance is not solitary. Around him is a structure, imperfect, strained, but vital, that has kept him going all these years. It's time to enter that structure and meet the family that never left his side. Ray Whittaker's world is narrow, not by choice, but by design, an accumulation of generational isolation, rural distance, and biological limitations. The house he shares with his siblings is the center of everything. Beyond it lies only the barest outline of a social life. He does not have friends in the traditional sense. There are no visitors who come just to see Ray, no outings to community centers, no shared hobbies with peers. His interactions are almost exclusively limited to the family members with whom he lives. For most of his life, that has been enough, or more accurately, it has had to be. Still, Ray has left the house. Occasionally, family members have taken him on outings, to the Walmart, to a local fair, to walk through a parking lot. These moments, while rare, offer brief glimpses into how Ray meets the outside world. He doesn't talk, but he notices. He doesn't initiate contact, but he reacts, sometimes with growls, sometimes with retreat, sometimes with a kind of startled patience. He is not aggressive, but he is guarded. Around unfamiliar people, Ray's behaviors become unpredictable. He may bark, bolt, or ignore completely. Strangers are not part of his learned rhythm. And yet, when given enough time and consistency, trust can emerge. One such moment came quietly. Ray extended his hand to someone he once barked at. It was not a grand gesture, just an open hand offered without prompting. But in the context of Ray's world, it was profound. A sign, not of social progress, but of human contact made on his terms. In Ray's life, connection doesn't come often, and it never comes easy. But it does come. And as the outside world began to look in, not just physically, but digitally, Ray's existence became something else, a subject of millions of eyes, stories, and opinions. Now, in the final chapter, we confront the consequences of that exposure and ask what it really means for someone like Ray to be seen. Ray Whittaker doesn't know he's famous. He doesn't know he's been filmed, edited, uploaded, and watched by millions. He has never seen a video of himself. He has never held a smartphone. He doesn't grasp what viral means. And yet, his face, his silence, his barking, his limp, has become a spectacle. What began as quiet observation soon turned into documentation, and then into controversy. People debated whether he was being helped or exploited, whether money donated in his name was being used properly, whether the camera should have ever been there in the first place. Ray has no opinion on this. He cannot give consent. He cannot protest. He cannot explain himself. The digital world that now contains fragments of his life is one he will never enter. And that is the final truth. Ray is seen, but cannot see back. He is heard, but does not speak. He is interpreted, but never asked. The images are real. The facts are real. But what remains most real is the man himself. Quiet, persistent, surrounded by siblings, living on his own terms in a house the world had long forgotten, until it didn't. He did not seek the world's attention. It found him. And in his silence, we are left to ask what it truly means to look, and whether we've really listened.